Good evening, Sir Bagwal and classmate. The article that assigned for me is Article 1179 to 1182. Let's proceed to Article 1179. Article 1179. Every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties, it is demandable at once. Every obligation which contains a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effect of the happening of the event. The first paragraph is talks about pure obligation. Ito po yung obligation na demandable at once. Kasi yung performance ay wala pong kondisyon at wala rin pong period or specific date which kailan gagawin or babayaran. Therefore, immediately demandable. So yun po yung pure obligation. For example, Pogi promised to deliver a specific car to Ganda. Ganun lang po yun. Simple as that. Or Ganda promised Pogi to give 10,000 pesos on demand. So, kaagad-agad po. Kasi wala pong kondisyon or period kung kailan ibibigay, immediately demandable na po siya. Agad. Kapag ganyan po, pwede ka pong mag-demand agad ng delivery. That is pure obligation. In the contrast naman po, nandyan po yung conditional obligation or obligation with a firm or period. So, what is the meaning of conditional obligation? Conditional obligation is one whose consequences are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. From the word itself, conditional obligation. Po, kapag condition under the law, it is future and uncertain event upon which the effectivity of an obligation, rights subject to it depend. So may two requisite po, futurity and uncertainty, kung saan nakadepende po yung birth or deather ng obligation. But take note po, a condition may also refer to past event unknown to the parties. Kung future event po, dapat uncertainty yung happening niya. Walang katiyakan kung mangyayari or hindi po. Pero kapag po past event naman po, ang importante unknown to the party. Past event unknown to the party, condition pa rin po siya. Pero bakit nga ba po kapag future yung condition, dapat uncertain? Kasi po kapag certain po yan or future and certain, sigurado pong mangyayari. Hindi na po yung conditional obligation magiging obligation with a period na po siya. There are two principal kind of condition, which is suspensive and resolutory condition. Suspensive condition. Kapag suspensive po, ito yung parang sinususpend po ang effectivity ng obligation hanggang sa mangyari or maganap yung condition. Doon na rin po magkakaroon ng visa or effectivity ang obligation. No fulfillment, no obligation. For example, Professor Pogi give 10,000 pesos if Ganda will pass the exam. This is suspensive because it suspends the demandability of the obligation. Hanggat hindi pa napapasa po ni Ganda yung subject, wala rin pong obligasyon si Professor Pogi na magbayad ng 10,000 pesos kay Ganda. Hindi rin po pwedeng i-demand ni Ganda na magbayad si Prof. Pogi ng 10,000 pesos sa kanya. Second is resolutory condition. Dito, yung happening ng condition extinguishes the obligation. So, parang kabaligtaran lang po ng suspensive. The obligation takes effect at once. Kaagad may obligasyon. But, if you terminate, mawawala po siya upon the happening of the event of the condition. So, If suspensive condition is fulfilled, the obligation arises, magkakaroon ng obligasyon. While resolutory condition that is fulfilled, ang obligasyon ay mawawala, it will extinguish the obligation. Question po. When is an obligation demandable at once? Meaning, demandable na siya agad. Obviously, na-discuss ko na po kanina yung pure obligation. When the obligation is pure, it is demandable at once. Second is nasa second paragraph ng Article 1179. Every obligation which contain a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effect of the happening of the event. Same po sila ni pure obligation. Parehas po silang demandable at once. Yung sa resolutory obligation nga lang po, without prejudice to the effect of the happening of the event. Kasi kapag nangyari po yung condition, mawawala na po si obligation. So, yung third po is when it's subject to a resolutory period. When we reach Article 1193 to Article 1197, ma-explain po yung about po dyan. So, let's proceed to Article 1180. When the debtor binds himself to pay when his means permit him to do so, the obligation shall be deemed to one with a period subject to the provision of Article 1197. So, let's discuss first the obligation with a period. As I said, kapag obligation with a period, future and certain. Kapag conditional obligation, future uncertain. Ang sabi ng Article 180, kapag sinabi ni debtor na magbabayad siya with his means permit to do so, yan daw ay with a period. The obligation is not conditional but with a period. Kasi po, yun yung sabi ng batas. Pero actually po, dahil po yun sa payment does not depend upon the will of the debtor. This is only the time, yung oras lang kung kailan ba i-fulfill yung obligation. It is not whether or not. Dapat ba siyang mag-deliver? Dapat ba siyang magbayad? Or dapat ba siyang mag-fulfill ng obligation niya? Hindi ganon. Kasi kapag ganon, conditional po. Pero dito, dapat talaga. He's bound to deliver his obligation. Pero kung kailan yun, yan po yung hindi natin alam. Unpredictable. So, obligation with a period. So, pag sinabi na I will pay you when my means permit to do so, sabi is obligation with a period. So, ang question, when is the obligation demandable? Kailan nagde-demand si creditor? Kailan ba yung means period to do so? Kaya ang right ni creditor ay pumunta sa court at hayaan ng korte na ayusin ang bail para sa pagbabayad. Si creditor pa ang magde-demand ng payment. He is only asking the court to fix the date of payment. Once na-fix na ng korte ang time, the obligation now becomes demandable on the date fixed. So, obligation with the period will be discussed by the next reporter from Article 1193 to Article 1197. Let's proceed to Article 1181. In conditional obligation, the acquisition of rights as well the extinguishment or loss of those already acquired shall depend upon the happening of the event, which constitute the condition. This article reiterates or paulit-ulit na sinasabi ang pagkakaiba ng suspensive condition sa resolutory condition. So, kapag suspensive, sabi nga, acquisition of rights. Yan kapag condition obligation na suspensive. Tapos kapag resolutory condition, extinguishment or loss of those already acquired. As simple as that, huwag na natin pahirapan. Let's proceed to Article 1182. Article 1182. When the fulfillment of condition depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void. If it depends upon chance or upon the will of the third person, the obligation shall take effect on conformity and with the provision of this code. In this code, we will understand potestative, obligation, casual, and mixed. So when the fulfillment of the condition upon the sole will of the debtor, this is called potestative obligation. Ang sabi, kapag potestative obligation, nakadepende siya sa sole will ni debtor. It is still void. Walang effect. So, take note din po yung word na fulfillment. So, meaning, sa suspensive obligation siya, applicable. Kapag resolutory obligation, kahit pa depende sa will ni debtor, it is still valid. Hindi po siya void. Now, if depends upon chance or the will of the third person, it is still valid. Now, let's discuss this kind of obligation under this provision ng Article 1182. The first one is potestative on debtor plus suspensive equals void. Ang sabi ay both obligation and condition are void. Example, I will give 10,000 pesos if I like the car that Pogi offered to me. Pag ganyan daw po, void kasi masyado naman pong halata. The obligation is illusory or hindi tunay. Parang naglolokohan lang po tayo. Next, potestative on debtor plus resolutory equals valid. Kapag ganyan daw po, obligation and condition are valid. Next, potestative obligation on the part of the creditor is valid. Obligation and condition are valid. Example, I will give 10,000 pesos. If you like the car I offer to you, ikaw yung magdi-decide, yun po yung sabi ng batas. Next is casual, one which depends exclusively upon chance. Pag ganun daw po, valid. Example, I will give 10,000 pesos if I win in Lotte tomorrow. Next is mixed. It depends of the will of either the party or at the third person. This is also valid. Example, I will give you 10,000 pesos if you marry Ganda this year. It is not entirely dependent upon the will of the debtor or mixed siya. Yung will ni Pogi at yung will ni Ganda, if papayag si Ganda magpakasal kay Pogi. So again, before we proceed to the next reporter, let me summarize ang sabi ng batas. When the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void. So take note, debtor. Meaning, if you only creditor, it is not void. It is valid kapag si creditor. Kapag depende sa chance or sa will ng third person, obligation is still valid. Pag mix naman, valid pa rin. Now, exception. Kahit pa po nakadepende sa will ni debtor, conditional obligation is still valid. Sinabi ko din po kanina na in case of resolutory and potestative, yung resolutory po kasi 'di ba immediately demandable na. And second is kapag may pre-existing obligation. So that's all po. Thank you.